Growing up, I heard many church leaders condemn necking and petting. But there was one problem. They never really defined it. As a deacon, I had no idea what they were talking about, and many of my friends felt the same way. When it came to necking, we imagined some strange ritual where a boy and girl somehow wrapped their necks around each other. I had seen some relay games at our ward youth activity where we would hold an egg under our chins and then attempt to pass it to someone else without using our hands. It surprised me that such a game would be played at a church activity, because that game came awful close to what I thought necking was, and I still couldn't see how that would bring much pleasure. Hello, and welcome to WordWise. I'm your host, Kit, and today we'll be discussing Chad Daybell's 2 books of religious advice for young people. In case you started watching my channel for my Sarah Boone coverage and don't know much about Chad Daybell, I'll quickly recap. Chad Daybell is a cult leader who has never had a genuine spiritual experience. He hates children and dogs, he loves seeing others get humbled, he faked 2 near-death experiences, and he never got over the heartbreak of failing to become a professional athlete. Oh, and he killed his wife and stepkids. Chad wrote 2 books of religious advice for young people, but I'm going to skip most of the actual religious advice. Not only does the slightest scrutiny cause it to break down completely, but it's pretty boring. The reason I decided to talk about these books is that Chad includes a lot of interesting personal stories, so I'm mostly going to focus on those. Oh, and I'm sorry about the chaos in my office. I am reorganizing this floor, and it's just going to be in flux for a while. Let's begin with The Aaronic Priesthood. Chad published this book through Cedar Fort in 2004. I assume he was still working at Cedar Fort at the time. The pencil sketch illustrations, which are pretty good, are the work of Chad's cousin, Rhett Murray, who also did the illustrations for Chad's picture book. Chad dedicated this book to his sons, and he divided it into 7 chapters, one for each of the letters in the word Aaronic. There's an acrostic theme to the title of the chapters, as you can probably guess from the cover, and I think that was Chad's first mistake. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has 2 different levels of priesthood, and the Aaronic priesthood is the lower level. Boys are usually ordained Aaronic priests in January of the year they turn 12. This is a bit confusing, but my understanding, and apologies if I have this wrong, is that there are 4 levels to the Aaronic priesthood. First you become a deacon, and then at 14 you can become a teacher, and at 16 you can become a priest. I don't think you become a bishop unless you're called as bishop of your ward, which is a leadership position. Aaronic priesthood holders are a little like altar boys in the Catholic Church. They help prepare sacramental bread and water, they pass the sacrament, they collect fast offerings, that kind of thing. I'm explaining this because Chad isn't going to. At no point in this book is he going to explain the basics of what the Aaronic priesthood is, or exactly what duties it entails, which is pretty much what I expect from Chad at this point. Chapter 1, Authority. The book begins like this. Congratulations! As an Aaronic priesthood holder, you are part of a great team that is growing each day and is sweeping the world. The gospel of Jesus Christ has been restored, along with Heavenly Father's priesthood power, the authority to act in his name. If you live righteously, you will hold this power throughout eternity. This is a partial definition of priesthood, but it doesn't translate into practical knowledge. What does it mean to act in Jesus' name? I'm sure some adults would read this and say, well, we all know what it means to act in Jesus' name because we've all seen people do it. But the point of writing an explanatory book is to explain, and Chad doesn't do that here. Probably because he doesn't know. After a quick discussion of who Aaron was in the Bible, we jump several thousand years forward to Chad's youth in the 1980s. When I was a deacon in the early 1980s, the young men in my ward would travel from our small town to the Tabernacle on Temple Square to attend the priesthood session of General Conference. On our first visit, we were seated up in the balcony, and we watched the people down on the front row get to meet the general authorities. We were a little envious, but that became our new goal. We decided that in 6 months we would be on the front row. We discovered that to do so, we had to get in line several hours early outside the tabernacle, but we did it, and it was worth it. While the rest of America's youth was lining up to get Motley Crue tickets, Chad was lining up to meet religious leaders, because he loves religion and he loves celebrities. Now, we know Chad is a liar, so it shouldn't surprise us that he tells a slightly different version of this story in his autobiography, but somehow it always surprises me. One of my Aaronic priesthood leaders asked our quorum members if we would like to attend General Conference. He told us he knew how to get front row seats in the Salt Lake Tabernacle for the priesthood session, and that we'd get to shake hands with the general authorities. He said it would require the sacrifice of standing in line for several hours, but he promised it would be worth it. Do the two versions of the story differ dramatically? No. Probably not even in any way that really matters. I just wanted to remind you to take everything Chad says with a grain of salt, because even when he has no reason to lie, he's probably doing so. In the autobiography version of the story, he leaves out the part where he goes one year and sits in the balcony. He skips straight to going and sitting in the front row where he can shake everyone's hand. Why? I don't know. Chad just lies about stuff. He's a liar. As I'm sure you recall, Chad loves to name drop celebrities. Before the priesthood session began, several of the general authorities came down into the audience and shook hands with the young men. Many people surrounded leaders such as Bruce R. McConkie and Paul H. Dunn. However, one apostle stood nearby, hardly noticed by the crowd. Thankfully, I had studied my chart of general authorities in the ensign during those long hours in line. I stepped toward him, extended my hand, and said, "Elder Hunter, how are you?" He smiled warmly and replied, "I feel wonderful." He asked my name, and I stammered a little, feeling excited to be talking to an apostle. They chat for a minute, and Elder Hunter is glad to hear that Chad is there with his father, because nothing makes me happier than seeing a father and son exercising their priesthood. So, exercising the priesthood means attending conferences together? That doesn't sound right, but I don't know enough about the priesthood to understand why it's wrong. I just guess I assumed that exercising your priesthood would involve a spiritual act, whereas this is, a physical act of attending a conference. Elder Hunter later became President Hunter, as Chad happily tells us. I also wonder if this conference influenced his admiration for Bruce R. McConkie. It's interesting that he mentions Paul H. Dunn, who was a member of the first quorum of the 70. Dunn was involved in a financial scandal, and in 1991, he had to issue a public apology to all of the LDS people in the world for having lied about his accomplishments, like playing Major League Baseball. He didn't. And also being a war hero multiple times over. He wasn't. Given that Chad also likes to exaggerate his accomplishments, I'm not surprised he saw this man as a role model. Chad name drops Elder Boyd K. Packer, too, and I'm curious if Chad's hateful homophobia was inherited from Elder Packer, who wrote a notorious 14-page pamphlet about the evils of being gay and how it was fine to physically assault queer people because we're dangerous. The church continued reprinting this pamphlet until 2016. The chapter ends like this. Think about it. The priesthood is yours forever unless you disqualify yourself through sin or by failing to exercise your priesthood. Treasure it. I'm curious if that power is revoked if you're excommunicated, or if Chad is in solitary playing with his priesthood. I'm at a loss as to what this chapter has to do with authority. Thus ends Chapter 1. Chapter 2, Action. We often talk about exercising our priesthood power. In some respects, the priesthood is like our muscles. If we don't use our muscles regularly, they might not perform properly when needed. The same principle applies to our priesthood. What? As usual, Chad is taking things very, very literally. Now, in some ways, I'm the worst person to review this because I'm not LDS, and I can't really understand what Chad is talking about. On the other hand, I'm kind of the perfect person to look at this, because since I don't know anything about it, I'm relying entirely on Chad's writing to give me information. So what I'm taking from this so far is that the priesthood power is like a muscle and you have to exercise it. And you do that by doing things in God's name. Because if you don't, then the priesthood power will stop working for you. I have this sneaking suspicion that this isn't quite in line with what the LDS Church teaches. Chad tells the story of how he cut his knee open sliding into home base during a baseball game when he was a kid. It's a story he told in his autobiography, only here he omits the part of the story where the doctor told him afterward not to bend his leg, but he couldn't resist and ripped out all his stitches. He jumps straight to the part where the doctor put his leg in a cast so that he couldn't do that again. Then he compares how weak his leg felt after they took the cast off to the way your spiritual abilities will weaken if you don't exercise them. The duties of the Aaronic priesthood are designed to keep you in top spiritual shape. By passing the sacrament, attending your priesthood quorum meetings, collecting fast offerings, and going home teaching, you build the spiritual muscles that will make you a great missionary and a worthy husband and father. I only had my leg immobilized for 2 months. Imagine if I didn't use that leg for 7 years, from age 12 to 19. Would my leg be at full strength when it was time to go on a mission? Of course not. And neither would my spirit if I didn't learn to exercise my priesthood during those years. As I just said, I'm not LDS. I'm not even a Christian. So I might be completely wrong about this. But I don't really understand how passing around the sacrament or collecting fast offerings will help you become a good husband or father. The problem is that Chad has never had a true spiritual experience, and he has no imagination, so he can't actually talk about what it feels like to have a strong spiritual life. Instead, he resorts to sports metaphors. If I had been writing this, I would have talked about how to connect to spirit and how it gets easier with practice. How if we don't do it when we're feeling okay, then it'll be that much harder to do it when we're feeling troubled. But if we practice getting into that spiritual space in our hearts, then it's easy to activate that habit so that we can connect to God in trying times. But that's me. Chad goes into a story about his hero, Steve Young. The story is that Steve played very badly during a game, but at halftime he was still optimistic that his team would win. Steve Young's greatness comes from his determination to never give up, especially when times are tough. It's a great attribute that we should make a part of our own lives. But it has nothing to do with the Aaronic priesthood or the idea of action, which is what this chapter is supposed to be about. I think Chad just wanted to talk about Steve Young. He omits the results of the game, which makes me think Steve's team probably lost. Next, Chad tells the story of his ancestor, Finity Daybell. We've heard this story at least twice before. It was in Chad's autobiography, and it was in An Errand for Emma. In the story, Finity defends Joseph F. Smith from an angry crowd in England in the 1860s. It's end-noted, however, in this book, and the endnote reads, Brickley, Ava Daybell, The Life of Finity and Mary Daybell, unpublished manuscript in possession of the author. If any descendants of Ava Daybell Brickley happen to have a copy of that manuscript, I would love to read it. That said, I don't know what this story has to do with the Aaronic priesthood either. I guess Finity was an Aaronic priesthood holder who took action, so Elder Smith thanked him? That's the conclusion Chad offers. Next, Chad tells a story about the importance of service work and how he once made 10 of his neighbors homemade Christmas cards to fulfill a service project requirement for a Boy Scout award. Believe me, these cards were very low-tech. I folded a piece of notebook paper in half, wrote Merry Christmas on the front in alternating red and green letters, and then wrote a paragraph or so in each card, complimenting them on what good neighbors they were, and things such as how I appreciated that we could play football in their backyard. I delivered each card on Christmas Eve, and I thought that would be the end of it. Then a strange thing started happening. These people began saying hello to me at church, and I actually became good friends with all of them. First, I think it's amusing that Chad compliments his neighbors not for being themselves, but for letting him use their yard. Second, it's noticeable that he's surprised when getting to know his neighbors leads to becoming friendly with them. His description of relationships is so transactional, and it's like he doesn't know how getting to know people works on some level. Third, he said earlier in this section that all his neighbors were elderly couples or widows, so I'm skeptical that he really became friends with them. There's a distinction between friends and friendly, but I'm skeptical that Chad understands it. Fourth, I seriously doubt that making 10 cards required 6 hours of service work, which means that Chad fudged the requirements for his Star Scout award. And fifth, what does this have to do with the Aaronic priesthood? Thus ends Chapter 2. Chapter 3, Reverence. Chad begins this chapter with a story about how, when he was made a teacher in the Aaronic priesthood, he and his friend Rob would take the sacrament to people who couldn't make it to church. Rob wasn't necessarily known in our ward as the most reverent person, but when we stepped through the front door of those homes, he would be on his best behavior. Rob, who was a priest, would give the sacrament prayers, and I would pass the bread and water to the people. We could feel the spirit in those homes, and much of the spirit was brought there by our own actions of reverence and quiet politeness. So here, Chad has reversed cause and effect, something he does with some regularity. Being quiet and polite doesn't bring reverence. A feeling of reverence inspires quiet and politeness. But I don't think Chad has ever felt reverence for anything, so he associates it with room conditions instead of an internal experience. The first time I blessed the sacrament, I was fairly calm until the moment I knelt down to give the blessing on the bread. Suddenly, it felt as if my tongue had expanded in my mouth, and I got a dry twitch in my throat that made me want to cough. I glanced down at my family, and although my parents had their heads bowed, my brothers were watching me very closely, so the pressure was on. Despite all the obstacles and a couple of pauses, I made it nearly to the end of the prayer before saying, "And keep his commandments which he has given him," instead of the word them. I knew I had made an error, but I hurriedly finished the prayer, hoping no one had noticed. I glanced over at the bishop, and he mouthed to me, "Do it again." It was a bit embarrassing to start over again, but now I am glad the bishop respected the sacrament ordinance itself and didn't say, "Good enough," just so I could avoid embarrassment. I learned a valuable lesson that day. Really? Can you verbalize it for me? I shouldn't complain. At least this story has obvious relevance to the Aaronic priesthood, and it contains practical advice. If you recite the prayer incorrectly, start over. That said, I'm not really sure what lesson it is that Chad learned. When he was 14, Chad became a visiting home teacher. Home teaching is called ministering now, but I'll stick with the language Chad uses in the book. He and his companion, David, would go to people's homes once a month and pray with them and maybe share a story from the gospel. Apparently, David was really good with people, so he was assigned to visit challenging church members, which I assume included Chad himself. I'm sure somebody in the bishopric said, "What are we going to do with this awkward, immature, kind of creepy kid?" And somebody else said, "Pair him up with David. David can work with anyone." In the middle of his recollections about David, Chad tells an interesting story. One particular widow we visited had a poodle named Fluffy. For some reason, that dog and I never got along. Fluffy would spend most of the visit barking and nipping at my feet, and I secretly dreamed of launching Fluffy right out the open window. But David acted like Fluffy wasn't even in the room, devoting all of his attention to the sister. I followed David's example and never hinted to the sister that maybe Fluffy would enjoy time alone in a locked room during our visit. Does anyone else remember Fluffy? Wait, let me Let me find Doug's dilemma. Yes. This is okay. I leaped to my feet and gave the woman a left forearm to the throat, knocking her off balance. She took a vicious swing at my head with the rolling pin, but she only grazed my shoulder before toppling onto her back. "Kill him, Fluffy! Bite! Bite!" the woman shrieked. The poodle was instantly nipping at my heels, but a swift golf swing with my backpack sent Fluffy sailing 20 feet into an ash-filled fireplace at the far end of the room. We find out on the next page that Fluffy was miraculously uninjured, or at least uninjured enough to further irritate Doug by continuing to bark. Chad seriously held a grudge against this dog for 20 years before immortalizing his imagined revenge in fiction. And what did Fluffy do to deserve Chad's continued loathing? Fluffy didn't like Chad. Have you ever heard that theory that animals can sense evil? We also visited a man named Jim. He and David would talk about everything under the sun except the gospel, but he was always friendly to us. As a teenager, I didn't quite understand David's motives. Why isn't David telling him not to smoke? I'd think to myself. Thankfully, David realized that being Jim's friend was more important than anything else at that time. Interestingly, as circumstances have changed in Jim's life, the gospel has now become important to him. And guess who is right there to help him along? That's right, David. So make it a goal to be the most polite, patient, and respectful home teacher you can be, even if Fluffy is nipping at your feet. This is one of those stories where you can see Chad's mind working, and you can watch him reach the wrong conclusion. He complains that David wasn't lecturing this man on the evils of smoking, which wasn't his job, because Chad really loves humbling people and associates spirituality with obedience. Then he writes that David taught him that being Jim's friend was more important than anything else. Only the conclusion of this section is to be polite, patient, and respectful. The lesson Chad should have taken from this was that it's more important to love people unconditionally than to judge and humble them. Also, and I sound like a broken record, but I don't know what any of this has to do with reverence. Apparently, Chad thinks that being reverent is somehow not pointing out that you shouldn't be smoking. After a brief section on the importance of prayer and showing respect to God at all times, Chad tells this story. When I was attending BYU, one day I rounded a corner and came face to belly button with Sean Bradley. Sean happened to be the 7'6" star of the BYU basketball team. I looked up at him and apologized. He smiled down at me and said it was no problem, and I've been looking up to him since, in more ways than one. Okay, how to put this? I have lousy gaydar. You'd think all queer people would have good gaydar, but mine is notoriously bad. So I'm not going to weigh in on Chad's orientation, which I know many people have speculated about, because I'm not sure. I think it's possible that buried somewhere beneath his virulent homophobia is a latent attraction to men, but I also think he's such a bad writer that he might accidentally be giving us the wrong impression. All that said, this reads like a meet-cute in a romance. I'm imagining a twinkle in Sean Brady's eye and an echoing twinkle in Chad's, and it's just awkward. If Chad isn't crushing on this guy, then he's at the very least fanboying. And he needs to be a bit more conscious of the subtext of what he writes. He includes 2 more pages about how great Sean Bradley is, and none of it has anything to do with reverence or the Aaronic priesthood. It's just an ode to Sean Bradley. Thus ends Chapter 3. Chapter 4, Obedience. It's time to discuss Chad's favorite subject, obedience. First, though, there's a brief mention of Chad's grandpa, Guy Chestnut. This, by the way, is the one-room schoolhouse that Guy attended. Chad's very proud of the fact that his grandfather went to school there. But I had to go to Wikipedia to figure out that the reason Chad included Guy Chestnut in this section is that Fruita, Utah is located in the Capitol Reef National Park, which is where the rest of the scene takes place. Chad's certainty that everyone knows the geography of Utah strikes again. Our family used to go to Capitol Reef every Memorial Day weekend, and one of my favorite activities was to play in the Fremont River that passes through the park. At one point, the river turns into a 40-foot-high waterfall. We would all go there and play beneath the waterfall, and some of the more adventurous relatives would actually stick their heads into the waterfall for a refreshing natural shower. However, our parents strongly warned us to never play in the river directly above the waterfall, since someone had actually been swept over the falls and killed a few years earlier. I looked for this waterfall online, and I looked, and as far as I can tell, there's only one waterfall on the Fremont River, and it ain't no 40 feet high. I've read estimates that range from 12 to 20 feet. Shane at climbutah.com kindly allowed me to use this photograph, and if you want to see the incredible natural beauty of Utah, I urge you to check out his YouTube channel, Climb Utah, which I'll link below. As you can see from Shane's photo, there's no way this is a 40-foot-high waterfall. So Chad has gone from assuming we all know the geography of Utah to assuming no one else has ever seen this waterfall. Well, when I was 12, my curiosity got the best of me. Without telling anyone, I hiked up the trail above the falls. I looked at the river and couldn't see why my parents were making such a big fuss. The river was only 2 feet deep and 10 feet across, and seemed perfectly safe. The bottom of the river was smooth sandstone, and it was almost like a natural water slide. I sat down in the water and let the river slowly push me along. The waterfall was at least 50 yards away, and I was certain I could easily just stand up and get out of the river as I approached it. Then suddenly the river became much swifter as it approached the waterfall. I quickly stood up, but my feet couldn't grip the sandstone. I slipped onto my stomach twice, and I sensed I was about to get thrown over the waterfall and smashed onto the rocks below. I said a quick prayer, and miraculously this time my feet took hold on the edge of the waterfall. I carefully inched my way to the riverbank and thanked the Lord for saving me. The first time I read this story, I stopped, went back, and read it again. There are so many things that jump out to me, but I'll just mention the most important parts. To begin with, I'm not convinced any part of this story is true. It sounds remarkably similar to Chad's supposed near-death experiences. During the first, he was cliff jumping, and in the second, he was playing in the ocean. Water comes up a lot in Chad's stories about his fake near-death experiences. He even says it was a miracle that he didn't go over the edge, and how convenient that no one was around to witness the incident. When Chad wrote this book, he was working as a managing editor at Cedar Fort, and if there's a miracle here, that's it. And his boss was Lee Nelson, who's a famous LDS author. And one of the things he's famous for is editing the Beyond the Veil series, which are collections of stories about Mormon near-death experiences. I wonder if Chad had started reading those books and doing that thing he likes to do where he edits his memories, and this was a sort of halfway moment between him getting interested in near-death experiences and faking his own. Hi, editing Kit here. So I was preparing a clip from an interview Chad did in 2011 for a section later in the video, but I found just a brief one that I'm going to include here, so I'm just letting you know for context.
She called me up and says, "You really need to meet this lady." And I was a little skeptical. I'd had a couple other people, I think, try to fool me and exaggerate their stories. So I went down to Sanpete County where Suzanne lived and interviewed her. And
now, as a newspaper editor, you knew how to do that. You knew how to interview somebody to really come at them from a couple different angles and see if they were, like you say, exaggerating or flowering up the story, so to speak.
Because I have read a lot of books about near-death experiences, and also doctrinally I wanted to make sure she was on track.
He doesn't quite call this a near-death experience, but he certainly implies that he almost died. That's why he had to exaggerate the height of the waterfall. If you fall from 15 feet and land in water, you might be fine. But if you fall from 40 feet, you're a lot less likely to be fine. In fact, the waterfall is so dangerous that the National Park Service closed it off to swimming and wading in 2012 after 3 people nearly drowned in 3 weeks. The second thing that struck me was the paragraph that comes right after the section I just read. The prayer Chad is referencing is the one he claims to have recited out of gratitude for being saved. I must admit, my prayer felt a little hollow. I knew that I wouldn't have been in that situation if I had simply obeyed my parents. I'd been warned of the dangers, yet I had ignored them. I quickly learned that obedience is crucial in our daily lives. One of the stories that appeared in the Beyond the Veil books, and in Spirit World Manifestations, which Chet has also read, is a story about a disobedient boy who ignores his mother's warning not to play in the river, and he gets trapped under a log and drowns. Then he visits the spirit world, where he's basically chewed out for ignoring his mother. They told me that my death was caused by disobedience to my parent. I felt keenly on this point, and informed them that if I were allowed to re-enter my body, I should never be guilty of the same sin again. The last line of this story reads, "The incident may serve to point a moral by which some young people may profit." Really? Well, maybe somebody should rip it off and put it in a book of religious advice for young men. Oh wait, Chad already did that. As I said, I'm not convinced this happened to Chad. If some version of it did happen, I think it's likely that Chad came up with this interpretation and the spiritual lesson he gleaned from it much, much later. After a story about how President Kimball refused to drink booze and found women who smoked disgusting, Chad goes back to sports and basketball star Devin Durant. However, his father, George Durant, has often said, "I am more proud of the person Devin is off the court than I am of who he is on the court." That is quite a compliment, considering the many records Devin set while playing for BYU. I'm sure the idea that a person can love their child for something other than their sports performance is shocking to Chad. Then he includes a 2-page long quote from Devin Durant on the importance of keeping a journal, followed by President Woodruff's story about how his horses almost froze to death because he ignored a prompting from the spirit. Thus ends Chapter 4, which so far is the only chapter in which the contents have anything to do with the title. Chapter 5, Nobility. I don't think Chad has any idea what nobility means. He tells a story about how when Joseph Smith was in jail, one of the guards started mocking him and talking about all the Latter-day Saints he had robbed or killed. And Joseph Smith completely lost his cool and started screaming at this guy that if he didn't shut up, one of them would die. I don't know if this story is true or not, but it was related by Parley P. Pratt, who claimed to have witnessed it, and Parley was a lot. Anyway, I don't see how flipping out and screaming at someone like a frosted-tipped Karen is an example of nobility. Then Chad talks about how his youngest son, Mark, likes to say no a lot. I assume Mark was quite young at the time this book was written. One night he got out of bed and began marching around the living room, singing no. Strange choice of verb there. His singing attracted the attention of the whole family, and soon everyone in the family was out of their beds. We gathered around this cute little boy, and he finally stopped saying no as I grabbed him, and we all gave him a big hug. I hope Mark has that same enthusiasm about saying no as he gets older. I don't expect him to march around school shouting no when he is first offered alcohol, but I do pray that no is the word that comes out of his mouth. I would also hope that no is a part of your vocabulary. Does this say he expects Mark to be offered alcohol at school? That's strange. I mean, the whole story is strange, mostly because it's not really a story. One night, Mark got out of bed and went into the living room and said no a lot, and everyone woke up. Okay. Also, it made me really nervous when Chad wrote that he grabbed Mark. You can guess why. Next, Chad tells a story about how when he was 12, some teenage boys in his neighborhood were big fans of Evel Knievel and enjoyed jumping their bikes off ramps. Chad would hang around and watch them, and one day one of the boys asked him if he wanted to do something cool. He said to me, "Lay down on the sidewalk and I'll jump my bike over you." It seemed pretty harmless, so I chose a spot about 5 feet away from the bike ramp. He yelled at me, "No, that's too close. Move a little farther." He kept coaxing me until I was about 10 feet from the ramp. In my mind, the Holy Ghost was practically shouting at me, "Go home now!" But I ignored the prompting, not wanting to offend this older boy who was suddenly treating me like a friend. Well, a few seconds later, he came pedaling hard down the sidewalk, and at the last moment, I started rolling toward the ramp. He flew through the air, and his back tire landed right where my head had been a moment earlier. He skidded to a stop and shouted, "Hey, idiot! Why did you move?" I quickly realized he wasn't my friend at all. My initial response to this story was to feel a little bit bad for Chad, because it's obvious that he was desperately uncool and lonely as a child. And I still think that's probably true, but I'm also perplexed by this story. I've never jumped a bike off a ramp, but my impression is that landing on something, like a kid's head, would cause you to crash. So I wonder if Chad misinterpreted what happened here, or if he's just lying about it. Possibly both. Never forget that you are part of a noble, royal generation. The Lord is eager to bless you and has great blessings waiting for you if you obey his commandments. I know you have the strength to do what is right. This doesn't have anything to do with nobility. This is about obedience again. The strength to do what's right? Obeying the commandments? Thus ends chapter 5. Chapter 6, integrity. It should come as no surprise that Chad doesn't know what integrity means. He talks about a couple of Mormon baseball players who didn't drink or chew tobacco or curse, which is going in the right direction, but then he writes this: "If you say you'll collect fast offerings or help with a service project, you'll do it. That's what integrity is all about." No, that's keeping your word, which is something a person with integrity would do, but they aren't the same thing. Chad tells a story about going to a campout with his Boy Scout troop. They were going to have a tin foil dinner, and he was sick of mulligan stew, so instead he got a frozen pizza out of the freezer and wrapped that up in tin foil. I had a nagging feeling this wasn't quite the meal Mom expected me to make. When I returned home the next day, she asked, "Chad, do you know what happened to the frozen pizza that was in the freezer? We were going to have it for dinner tonight, and now it's gone." It was a time of decision. I'd been gone for a whole day. Certainly one of my younger brothers could shoulder the blame. But, somewhat embarrassed, I explained what I had done. She laughed, but wasn't as impressed by my pizza dinner as my fellow scouts had been. I'd been gone for a whole day. Certainly one of my younger brothers could shoulder the blame. I don't know what to make of this sentence. How is Chad connecting these ideas? What is he trying to say? That he could claim he couldn't have taken the pizza because he wasn't home all day? I can't figure it out. Then he helpfully defines integrity. The point is that after making a mistake, we need to face up to it. We tell the truth. That is integrity. Telling the truth and honoring promises no matter the consequences. The Lord expects us to do so. No, that's honesty. How did Chad get a journalism degree without knowing how to use a dictionary? He shares another story from his youth. I read a bit of this one in a previous video, but I'll read it again now. The bishop came in and ordained Mike to the Aaronic priesthood. During the ordination, the bishop pronounced Mike's middle name in a way that struck me as funny, and I laughed a little. Then the deacon next to me laughed, too, and we struggled to control our giggles. My giggle stopped immediately, though, when Mike peeked over at me. There was a hurt look in his eyes, and when the ordination ended, the adult leaders didn't look too happy either. I looked away and acted like nothing had happened. At the very least, I should have told Mike I was sorry. But he didn't apologize, and Mike never came to church again. Years later, they ran into each other. Then, in our late teens, I crossed paths with Mike again on a summer work project. He seemed happy to see me, and we talked like old friends throughout the afternoon. However, I noticed that his hat had the word Budweiser across the front, and it was clear in other ways that the gospel wasn't a part of Mike's life. I definitely read this excerpt in another video because I remember talking about my beloved Marlboro shirt, which I wore for years even though I've never been a smoker. Look, I even found it on eBay. $80 seems a tad overpriced, though. My point, I believe, was that Chad seems to assume that because this guy had on a Budweiser cap, that means he's fallen from grace. Maybe he just got a free cap at the state fair and needed a hat for the day because he was working outside. Here's the lesson Chad shares with us. Don't fail to fulfill your duty to be a friend and an example. I know from personal experience the painful consequences that can come if you don't do so. Except he didn't suffer any consequences. Then he writes more about keeping your word and follows it up with a horror story about 4 Mormon youth who decided to let their hair down while out of town, only to be caught drinking in a bar by one boy's father's boss. Which, again, sounds more like a lesson in obedience than integrity. Thus ends chapter 6. Chapter 7, Covenants. This chapter opens with a story about sports. Color me shocked. Chad discusses a talented young football player who turned down an NFL contract because he was determined to keep the Sabbath holy. Regarding this, Chad concludes, the overall purpose of the Aaronic priesthood is to teach us to make commitments, or covenants, with Heavenly Father and prepare us for the rest of our lives. Are you sure? Because if you are, you probably should have put that in the first chapter. After that comes another story I've read before, so I'm only going to read the first part here because it's so telling. 8th grade wasn't my favorite year. In many ways, it was a struggle. My body decided not to grow that year, making me one of the shortest guys in school. Then some of my friends found new ones, and others started going a bit off the right path. At school, I wasn't necessarily unpopular, yet I wasn't popular either. I was just kind of there. I was just kind of there is probably the most accurate description Chad has ever written. He talks about avoiding peer pressure and how he got offered beer, and that leads into his story about being bullied in woodshop class. In this version of the story, he just sits and takes it, but in the version he's going to tell 15 years later in his autobiography, he told the teacher and the kid got moved. He ends the version of the story in the Aaronic priesthood like this. Let's just say I was relieved when summer finally came, and I was dreading 9th grade. I prayed for a better experience during the coming school year. This, of course, leads into his story about becoming good friends with his cousin Les in 9th grade. Regarding Les, he says, he later told me that he had been praying even before he had left Texas, that he could find a friend who wanted to live the gospel. I was essentially praying for the same thing, and the Lord answered both of our prayers. Except that Chad and Les weren't praying for the same thing. Chad wanted 9th grade to be less awful than 8th grade, and Les wanted to live the gospel. Chad describes how he met his 8th grade bully again at the missionary training center when he was 19, and how he was then taller than his bully by several inches. Important stuff. That brings up a good question, though. What if you are currently the bully at school? Or possibly you have another problem that is dragging you down spiritually. Is it possible to change your ways? Yes, it will take some work, but believe me, if Matt could make the change, you certainly can. If you read between the lines, it's obvious that Chad was a high school bully. He tells a story in his autobiography about throwing tomatoes and onions at a girl's house during her birthday party. He's written about pulling pranks on BYU's campus. And then there's the infamous cave date, which I recently confirmed did happen. Chad included a behind-the-scenes page about each of the books in his first trilogy. And on the page about Doug's dilemma, it says this regarding the character of Don Fowers. Don is based on my close friend, Mark Korth, who grew up in Mapleton. Our double date to Rabbit Ears Cave really happened, as described in the book. The two young ladies who suffered through it shall remain nameless. Unsurprisingly, Chad demonstrates zero insight into his own behavior. The next section of this chapter just kills me. Chad includes a summary of part of Doctrine and Covenants, section 20. The deacon is to watch over the church as a standing minister and to assist other priesthood members as called upon. The teacher is to watch over the church always and be with and strengthen them. This would include your home teaching assignments. The priest is to preach, teach, expound, exhort, and baptize, and administer the sacrament and visit the house of each member. This includes home teaching, as well as collecting fast offerings in areas where that takes place door to door. The teachers and deacons can assist with fast offerings as well. Why didn't he put this at the beginning of the book? This is foundational information. Obviously, he doesn't think his readers already know this, or he wouldn't have included it at all. So why didn't he think, maybe they need to know this earlier so they aren't completely confused by all this talk of teachers and priests and deacons? The book is almost over, but Chad has one more personal story to share, and it's just strange. When I was 14, our ward's young men decided to climb Mount Timpanogos, the mountain that towers above the Provo-Orem area. Since it was summer, we decided to start hiking at 10 p.m. and pace ourselves so we would arrive at the peak just as the sun was coming up in the east. I gather that night hiking is a thing. It sounds incredibly dangerous to me, but then I'm notorious for taking bad falls. Anyway, Chad went on this night hike. It was well after midnight. I had developed a bad headache and my legs were feeling tired, so I told myself I'd just take a rest. Another boy, Mickey, was feeling the same way, so our leaders agreed that we could rest for a few minutes and then catch up. Well, the next thing I remember was a beam of sunlight hitting me in the face. I had slept the rest of the night on that concrete floor. I never got to see the sunrise or beautiful Utah Valley below. I was disappointed with myself then, and even more now, because I have yet to attempt that hike again. And you never will. Something seems to be missing from this story. I don't know what it is, but I feel strongly that something is missing. For one thing, this is considered a difficult hike. I looked it up. One reviewer described the last stretch as basically rock climbing. But I found this interesting website called utahsadventurefamily.com, which told me that this 10 p.m. hike is a tradition for BYU students. Part of their description reads, "On the way up the trail, you'll pass half of BYU's student body coming back. Apparently, the thing to do is begin the hike to Mount Timpanogos at 10 p.m. and get back around 6 a.m. They all had the same story, though. It was too cold and windy to possibly make it to the top. I'm not sure why anyone would want to take this hike in the dark." And here is a photograph of this shelter at Emerald Lake that Chad mentioned. This is apparently where he spent the night. The same website had this comment. "This is nearly 6 miles into the Mount Timpanogos hike. There is a small lake that flows from the glacier, thus the green water. Some people were using water purifiers here. There's also a stone shelter with a fireplace. A scout troop had used it the night before, but they said they didn't get much peace from the frequent string of co-eds popping in to warm up. It will start to get a little cold and windy here, but you haven't seen anything yet. So, was Chad really sleeping all night? Was he flirting with co-eds? There are benches built into the walls of the shelter, but Chad says he slept on the floor. Did he and Mickey decide to lie down? I feel like I'm back in Sarah Boone's police interrogation. Like, what do you mean you didn't intend to fall asleep? You went into the shelter and lay down on the floor. I don't know, something here is fishy. It just doesn't make any sense to me that Chad went and sat down on this bench for a few minutes, and the next thing he knew it was morning and he'd slept all night on the floor. Then he tries to turn this whole hiking trip into a metaphor for spiritual progression. Church statistics show that many boys start the hike, become deacons, and a great many of those boys make it to Emerald Lake, become a teacher or even a priest. But not nearly enough young men are making it to the top of the mountain and receiving the Melchizedek priesthood. I encourage you, even if you start to feel a little tired on this journey, to keep pushing to the summit. When you make it to the top, it will be well worth the effort. In this case, it will lead you to eternal life. And while you're on your way to the top, please check that concrete building as you pass by. There's probably someone in there who needs to wake up. They might be a little grumpy with you at first, but someday they'll greatly appreciate that you helped them to the summit. Except that the shelter collapsed under heavy snow in 2023, and now it's just a pile of rubble. Thus ends the Aaronic priesthood. How could we have made this book better? Well, I guess I'd start by getting rid of this acrostic topic theme, or at least only use concepts relevant to the subject of the book, or at the very least, stick to words I can define. The only two concepts Chad actually talks about are obedience and covenants. So I'd move all of his lusting after obedience to that chapter and everything about promise keeping to the covenants chapter. I know this book is written for young men, but does that really mean that every other story needs to be about a sports figure? Part of the back cover reads, "Each principle is wonderfully explained through uplifting stories from the lives of well-known LDS athletes, such as Steve Young, Dale Murphy, and Sean Bradley, combined with wise counsel from the Lord's prophets and apostles." It's just such an awkward concept. I really feel like Chad should have spent more time learning about young people and less time obsessing over sports figures. I don't know why Chad kept writing books for children and young adults. He doesn't like children. My guess is that he thought the books would be short and easy to write and that kids wouldn't notice that they didn't make any sense. A lot of people think that about kids' books, and that partly explains why the picture book market is the most competitive book market. But I'll say the same thing about this book that I said about baptisms. Chad should have talked to the people for whom he was writing. He should have interviewed deacons and teachers and priests and said, "Hey, what has this meant to you? How has this ordination changed you or helped you? What has your experience been like? What would you tell someone getting ready to be ordained?" Unfortunately, I suspect that between Chad's fundamental awkwardness and the general recalcitrance of teenagers to confide in adults, such an interview would produce nothing but uncomfortable silence. The second book I'm going to discuss is The Youth of Zion, a book of religious advice for teenagers, written by a man who would go on to murder a teenager. The title page says it's guidance from modern prophets on dozens of timely topics facing today's families, and interestingly, that it was compiled by Chad Daybell. I guess Cedar Fort felt that he shouldn't take credit for the words of the prophets. This book was published in 2002, and it contains 34 very short chapters, some only 2 pages, plus an introduction, which essentially explains that this book isn't so much for teenagers as it is a reference that parents can refer to when telling their children what to do. He gives an example in which a friend's daughter was convinced not to wear a strapless dress by the words of Spencer Kimball. I'm not sure I buy that story. Anyway, I'm only going to cover the chapters that contain stories about Chad. The other chapters are made up exclusively of quotations and stories about the prophets' lives. If you're interested in that, well, maybe you should buy this book. We're going to start with Chapter 3, Dancing. Those of you who have watched many of my videos are no doubt aware that Chad is a bit obsessed with dancing. His fascination is apparent even in his first novel, An Errand for Emma, and it's a topic that comes up over and over. Chad seems to believe that you can tell a person's moral character by how they dance. Square dancing is wholesome and good exercise, but pretty much everything else is evil. The past few years have seen drastic changes in what the world views as acceptable dance styles. Elvis Presley's dance moves in the 1950s and chubby checkers, the twist in the 1960s, caused parents to be outraged. But those dances now seem rather innocent. Standards have sadly slipped. The suggestive dance moves that many performers use today would have gotten them kicked out of the building not many years ago. What I'm taking from this is that Chad believes pre-World War I dance styles were modest and polite. But dance has always been an eclectic, expressive art form, and because Chad is so sheltered and so uninterested in exploring the world around him, he can't appreciate things like this woman dancing to Duke Ellington in 1933. Does she not look like she's having the best time? I'll link the video below. It's well worth watching. I know Chad wouldn't approve, and that's fine. Everyone is entitled to their opinion. But I don't know why he had to bring Satan into it. Despite the poor examples among today's entertainers, dancing itself is a wonderful thing, in the right way and setting. Church-sponsored dances provide a great place to meet new people and develop social skills. Naturally, Satan would love for you to go beyond the boundaries of good taste, and many public dance clubs create an atmosphere for trouble. In Chasing Paradise, Chad commented many times that the souls in spirit prison who weren't receptive to the gospel spent their time at wild dance parties. I was disappointed by this chapter because I was hoping for a personal story that would explain Chad's fascination with dancing, but it doesn't contain one. If I could ask Chad Daybell one question, it would be, why are you so obsessed with dancing? What is the origin of your fascination? But I'll probably never get the chance to ask him that. And I'd probably be disappointed by the answer. He probably doesn't know. Why am I still talking? Thus ends Chapter 3. Chapter 4, Dating. Chad begins this chapter by explaining that if you never date, you won't be able to get married. He has a real gift for stating the obvious. He stresses the importance of having a temple wedding, then says that the first thing the prophets recommend doing is waiting. He goes from, you have to date in order to get married in the temple, which is the most important thing, to, but don't date yet. Wait until you're an adult. It's a little confusing. Finally, we get a personal story from Chad, and it's quite a story. In my 7th grade social studies class, I sat behind a pretty girl named Terry. She was so sweet and kind and seemed to have the world ahead of her. It is safe to say that every boy in our grade had a crush on her. School let out for the summer, and when we returned that fall to begin 8th grade, I looked in the halls for Terry because she would always say hello to me. After 2 days, I finally asked my friends, "Did Terry move away?" One of them started laughing. "Haven't you heard?" he asked. "Terry quit school. She's pregnant." The news really shook me up. I had thought only really frightening girls got pregnant out of wedlock, not someone like Terry. But she had let her guard down over the summer, trusting a boy who didn't truly respect her. What I think is interesting about this story is that last paragraph. This isn't the first time Chad has described someone straying from his value set as a scary experience. He was shaken up by Terry's pregnancy. And I think this association between fear and so-called sin explains why he says that only really frightening girls got pregnant out of wedlock. What was frightening about them? When I think of a frightening teenage girl, I think of Fairuza Balk from The Craft. But I think that for Chad, the girls are scary because they're pregnant, because they've strayed from what he considered appropriate behavior. And he has no right to claim that the father of Terry's baby didn't respect her. He doesn't know that. But for him, failure to follow church rules is disrespect. Thus ends chapter 4. Chapter 5, Discouragement. Chad talks about his friendship with Milt Harrison. He's mentioned Milt in nearly all of his nonfiction. Milt was an elderly man who lived in Chad's neighborhood. He contracted polio when he was young, and in the last years of his life he lost a lot of strength. So his wife arranged for Chad to visit them every morning and every night, and help this man dress and move from his bed to his wheelchair and vice versa. This continued for 3 years while Chad was a teenager, and then Milt passed away. Here, Chad tells the story of how Milt lost his ring finger. I'll spare you the details, but it involves a barbed wire fence and a cheap ring. The wound became infected, and that was when Milt contracted polio. Milt was bedridden for many months, but finally he developed enough strength to go back to school. That was almost as terrible, as the other children mocked him for his missing finger and the crutches he used. The story surprised me, because I knew Milt had accomplished many things in his life, such as graduating from BYU, having a successful accounting career, serving on the city council, marrying a lovely wife, and raising 2 daughters. Wow, I said. I probably would have given up. What gave you the courage to accomplish what you did? Milt responds that he leaned on Jesus, and he says a little about how he struggled to get to his classes at BYU. Chad's statement that he probably would have just given up stands out to me as very immature. I mean, what was he imagining? That Milt would end his life? This isn't $1 Million Baby. But I do think this is a good story, and for once, Chad has managed to include a story that's actually relevant to the topic at hand. Milt's story of overcoming adversity is a good one. Then Chad tells a story about Heber Grant becoming a star athlete because everything has to come back to sports with this man. Thus ends chapter 5. Chapter 6, Education and Employment. We have all been sent to Earth with different talents. I am able to write, but anything beyond basic math strains my brain. I am also completely unskilled when it comes to drawing a picture. My 6-year-old draws better pictures than I do. I mean, his ability to write is debatable. He discussed nearly failing a math class in his autobiography, but this is the first time we've heard that he can't draw. The next page includes more things he thinks he's not good at. My father is an electrician, and as a child I felt duty-bound to become one too. It made me nervous though, because as I mentioned, I don't have a mechanical mind. Words like watt, volt, and circuit breaker sounded complicated. So it came as a surprise and relief when one day Dad told me I didn't have to be an electrician. He tells the same story in his autobiography. I'm perplexed by his statement that the words watt, volt, and circuit breaker sounded complicated. 2 of those words are very short and simple, so I'm not sure why he'd be concerned that they represent complicated ideas. But what I'm taking from this sentence is that Chad doesn't want to deal with complicated things, and that tracks. This is a man who's simple and literal and can't handle nuance or complexity. There's another brief but amusing personal story in this chapter. We must reach our potential and use our talents, moving to a different job as our skills improve and opportunities come our way. I certainly wouldn't be reaching my potential if I was still clinging to one of my first jobs, emptying garbage cans each night at a local park. Every time I smell Kentucky Fried Chicken, it still reminds me of those seemingly endless rows of garbage cans filled to the top with chicken bones each summer night. But it also reminds me how far I've progressed in my professional life. I don't think he references this job anywhere other than this book. I was under the impression his first job was grave digging. I'm curious about why there was so much chicken in these garbage cans. Was there a KFC next door to the park? Thus ends Chapter 6. Chapter 8. Family. For good or bad, you will be linked to your family throughout your life. Friends that seem inseparable now might suddenly no longer be part of your life with a simple change in circumstances. And to your surprise, your annoying little sister might turn out to be your best friend 15 years from now. I thought this was kind of weird, because Chad has a younger sister, and she's so inconsequential in his life that in his autobiography she's mentioned only once, and it's in the caption of a family photo. I've never heard him say anything about her, other than that he named Doug's wife Becky after her. But that's not really saying much, because he names all of his characters after people he knows. This chapter is mostly about the importance of family. There's a section on family histories, which we all know Chad loves, and family homemaking, which I think is a nice practice. Thus ends Chapter 8. Chapter 11, Friends. Chad discusses how the wrong friends can drag you into the misery of sin. He provides an example. I had a friend named Dave who came from a good family and who had a great future ahead of him. There was a group of us who would play basketball or golf after school, and Dave was one of the better players. But Dave became curious about candy. He thought candy might help him do better in school and at sports. He found ways to get some candy, and he started smoking it at night. Some people are very firmly against any eating of candy, as YouTube would have us call it. Some people have well thought out reasons for that position, and other people, like Chad, feel the need to divide the world into good and evil with a very thick black line. But there's nothing in this story to suggest that Dave's habit was negatively affecting his life. And I'm not advocating teen candy use. There's plenty of research showing that waiting until after your brain is finished developing is important. I'm just saying that Chad's reaction to Dave's evening joint is a bit much. The rest of us had to make a hard decision. Would we follow Dave's invitation or break off our friendship with him? We cared a lot about Dave, but we finally chose to stop hanging out with him rather than jeopardize our own futures. Dave didn't even seem to mind, and he found other friends that approved of his habit. Again, everything is so black and white. Why does it have to be we either join him or we cut him off? I grew up in Kentucky, and I had friends who started smoking tobacco in the 4th grade. Did I smoke with them? No. I tried it once, and my chest hurt for days. Of course, I thought you were supposed to suck on the cigarette as hard as you could. My point is, I didn't cut my smoker friends out of my life. I just didn't smoke with them. Obviously, some addictions and some relationships require cutting a person off. But Chad's situation doesn't sound like one of them. If Dave hadn't told his friends what he was doing in the evening, would they have even noticed a change in him? I still wonder if there was a better way to help Dave, but that situation reminds me that friendships are often like climbing a steep trail. We can brace ourselves and lend a hand to help lift each other up, or we can relax and let others pull us down. In this case, we tried to lift Dave up, but he wasn't interested. It was a better alternative than letting him pull us down. This paragraph has a real, if you aren't with us, you're against us feeling. There's just no room for more subtle considerations. Also, why didn't Chad tell us what happened to Dave? Is it because he didn't suffer a terrible end? Or because he ceased to exist when Chad ended their friendship? I think that friendships are hugely important in the lives of young people. and I can't help noticing that this entire chapter is focused on warnings about friends leading people astray. Why isn't there anything about how to make friends, how to be a friend, how to resolve conflict with your friends in a non-scorched earth fashion? That's just what I would have focused on if I had been writing this. Thus ends chapter 11. Chapter 17, Honesty. I was 8 years old and had gone with Dad to our local hardware store to buy a can of paint. We found the paint we needed, then made our purchase at the counter. We climbed back into the truck, then Dad paused to look at his receipt. "Chad, this doesn't add up. We need to go back inside." We hopped out of the truck and marched back into the store. I figured we had been overcharged, and I was hoping maybe I could get some candy with the extra change we'd be getting back. But to my surprise, Dad told the clerk, "You gave me too much change. The paint was $6.99, not $6.49. Then Dad pulled 2 quarters out of his pocket and handed it to the clerk. At that moment, the store owner stuck his head out of an office and said to the clerk, "See, Dave? I told you Jack would be back. He's an honest man." Dad was sheepish about it, and we went back to the truck without mentioning what had happened. But a deep impression had been made on me. The store owner considered my father an honest man. Since that day, I have tried to follow that example. No, he hasn't. Chad's a liar. He lies constantly, and he lies about trying to follow his father's example. His autobiography is packed with lies. His lawyer lied at his trial. Not just about Chad's guilt, but about things like whether or not Chad's house has stairs. When did Chad become a liar? Did that change over time? I would guess he started lying in childhood or as a teenager. Probably about the time he decided to massacre an entire hive of bees. He does it so often and so casually. One of the strangest lies I've heard him tell was during an interview he gave to a local bookshop/antique store owner in 2011. In it, he lies about the time frame of the novels in the Standing in Holy Places series.
Now, the five volume set, over a what time span does it? Is it like a 10-year span or a 5-year span?
About 20.
20 years.
The first 2 volumes cover 2 or 3 years, and the third one kind of is a bridge for 10 to 20 years.
Okay.
With lots of events, and then the last 2 take place the last 3 years before the second coming of the Savior.
None of that is true. But why lie about it? I'll end with a quote from chapter 17. "In today's world, honesty is sometimes a challenge. But once you decide to be honest in all you do, you will find temptations fade away. You'll find it easier to keep your eyes on your own paper, to put in a full day's work, and so on. If honesty hasn't been your top priority, give it a chance. You'll like it." Was that an embedded confession that Chad cheated in school? Thus ends chapter 17. Chapter 18, Humility. In general, Latter-day Saints are wealthier, healthier, and more talented than many of their peers. Good grief. Okay, I'm sorry. I just don't buy that one group of people is more talented than another. And health and wealth often go together because rich people can afford private chefs and private trainers and grass-fed cow's milk. But the veracity of this statement is almost beside the point. What kind of person has the gall to write something like this in a chapter on humility? It boggles the mind. Chad further demonstrates that he doesn't really know what humility is when he tells a story about unfairly judging someone. One of my most painful memories of improperly judging someone happened in 5th grade. Yes, I was young, but I also should have known better. My elementary school also served as the learning center for children in our area who had mental or physical handicaps. These children usually had their own recess time, but once in a while we overlapped. There was a young lady in that class named Gussie who had been born with serious birth defects. She had a very flat face, crooked teeth, and couldn't talk very well. Her legs were quite short, but her most obvious feature were her fingers. They were all grown together, almost like they were webbed. During this particular recess, she came toward where my friends and I were playing dodgeball. She shuffled toward me and said, "Chad, I play?" I was surprised she knew my name, and my friends teased me a little. I acted like she hadn't said anything, so she said it again and moved toward me on the dodgeball court. Finally, I turned around and said, "Gussie, get off the court. We don't need you here." My friends added, "Yeah, Gussie, get out of the way." I watched her eyes fill with sadness. I wanted to say something nice, but I was too worried about what my friends might think. I stayed silent as her shoulders slumped and she went back into the building. As she shuffled away, I had my first experience at being completely disgusted with myself, but I didn't ever have the courage to apologize to her. Gussie rarely was seen on the playground again, and when she did come out, she stayed away from me. I moved on to middle school the next year, and I soon lost track of her. Two things stand out to me about this story, beyond the obvious sadness of it. First, this is easily the most detailed description of a person in all of Chad's published writing. His description of Tammy in his autobiography was less detailed, and he married her. 20 years later, he still remembered the parts of this child that he found visually objectionable. Very strange. Second, here's another story about Chad doing something rotten to someone and refusing to apologize. He never apologized to that kid whose name he snickered at either, the one whose later decision to wear a Budweiser hat demonstrated that he'd lost all love for God. As if this story weren't depressing enough, Chad follows it up by saying Gussie died when he was 15. He says he'll apologize to her in heaven, which sounds like a great excuse not to apologize to someone. However, that experience taught me a lesson, and I have tried to never again judge another person by their outward appearance. This is just a flat-out lie. I'm not quite clear on how this incident taught Chad not to judge people on their appearances, which, by the way, is one of the defining features of Chad's fiction. The state of any character's immortal soul can be easily discerned by looking at them. But how is this story a lesson in not judging someone on their appearance? Yes, Chad judged her on her appearance, but he wasn't wrong that she had physical deformities. He was wrong that she deserved cruelty because of them. If Gussie had turned out to be amazing at dodgeball, that would have been a lesson in not judging others based on their appearance. The lesson Chad seems to have actually learned is that you can hurt someone's feelings even if they aren't physically perfect. It's almost like the lesson he learned was that Gussie was a human being. Maybe that's why his description of her was so detailed. He was trying to justify the fact that he hadn't realized she was a person. But also, he says that his primary concern, and the reason he was mean to Gussie, was because he wanted to look cool in front of his friends. And yet, he doesn't seem to have learned any lesson from that, and we know he would go on to do stupid things like jumping from a 60-foot-high cliff in order to impress his friends later on. Thus ends Chapter 18. Chapter 22, Modesty and Fashion Styles. This chapter begins with a story I've read before about a friend of Chad's named Dusty who had to have a talk with his teenage sister-in-law about her tawdry appearance and how it was forcing men to stare at her and indulge in bad thoughts. Then Chad asks the reader to guess in which year a modern prophet made a statement, the sentiment of which is that women are imitating the dress of ladies of the night. Was that in 1988? 1968? Try 1918. Joseph F. Smith had noticed a downward trend in fashion even then. Who knows what he would say about today's midriff-bearing, low-cut tops and tight, hip-hugging jeans? Ah yes, the horrors of 2002 fashion. Needless to say, I found pretty much everything in this chapter offensive. Some fads are harmless fun and go away quickly. The fad of body piercing, though, certainly isn't harmless. This includes the piercing of the body for multiple rings in the ears, in the nose, in the belly button, even stainless steel rods through the tongue. Actually, you can pierce much more scandalous body parts than the tongue. This section offended me not because of the judgment of people who enjoy piercing, but because of Chad's use of the word fad to describe a practice that dates back at least 5,000 years. Before I read the next excerpt, I want to clarify that Chad has to be talking about his grandpa Guy Chestnut here, because Grandpa Keith died tragically in a logging accident when he was quite young. When my grandfather joined the Navy in the 1940s, he did what many new sailors did. He got a tattoo of an anchor on his arm. He did it for a noble purpose, to show patriotism. But now, at 80 years old, he still has that tattoo anchored to his arm. He once told me he wished he had never gotten it. At least Grandpa's tattoo had a logical purpose. I feel sad when I see a handsome young man who has a strange design tattooed on his neck or back. Maybe he put it there so he can't see it, but the rest of the world can. Most people are saying to themselves, what was he thinking? They're thinking, that's not what the stencil looked like at all. I spend far more time than I should on the Bad Tattoos subreddit, and I admit I am routinely astonished by the things people want on their bodies. That said, just because President Hinckley doesn't like how tattoos look doesn't mean that the people who get them don't either. Thus ends Chapter 22. Chapter 23, Music. Those of you who watched my videos on Chad's autobiography will likely recall a 14-year-old Chad's certainty that the Billy Joel hit Only the Good Die Young was a secret message to him, warning him that he was going to die young. Luckily, that didn't dampen his love of music, which you can see quite clearly in his terrible book of LDS-related top 5 lists. There are a lot of lists about music in there. In this book, he tells a different story about music. Naturally, there are pitfalls in the music world. Many times, a popular artist might have a wonderful song, but the rest of the CD will essentially be trash. During high school, I bought a cassette tape of one of the most popular singers of the 1980s. His songs were always on the radio and were played at our school dances. But when I bought his tape, I sadly realized the songs that weren't being played on the radio were filthy. The melodies were quite good, but the words made me very uncomfortable. Okay, tell me in the comments whose 1980s album you think this was. I figure it was either Prince or George Michael, because I think Michael Jackson was probably too tame, Dirty Diana aside. Up to this point, Chad's story has been pretty relatable, but his reaction to discovering that he didn't like the album is not. I went to my dad's tool chest, grabbed a hammer, and with one solid blow, I smashed that tape to pieces. I missed hearing the songs I liked, but it wasn't worth having to fast forward through the ones I didn't like. Look, I bought Imogene Heap's Eclipse because I liked that song Jason Derulo sampled, and I hated every other song on that album, but I didn't drop my computer from a second-story window. This is an extreme response. Chad didn't just think this wasn't an album for him. He felt it wasn't an album for anybody, and that such music shouldn't exist in the world. Then, he tries to convince the reader to order a 14 CD set of recordings of all of the hymns in the LDS hymn book for just $9.50 plus shipping, by promising that hearing a teen play hymns will really freak their parents out. Also, it's pretty ironic that Chad felt Only the Good Die Young was a message from God to him, given that it's a song about a guy trying to convince his Catholic girlfriend to give it up before marriage. Thus ends Chapter 23. Chapter 27, Esual Purity. I'm going to have to watch my language when talking about this chapter, because Chad has broken the chapter into surprisingly specific sections. Because, as Chad explains, sexual sins come in a great variety. It's the chapter of forbidden words. And the first of those forbidden words is a medical procedure that begins with the letter A. You can probably guess what the prophets have said on this topic. Then we get to my personal favorite sin, gayness. Every new television season seems to include a show that revolves around a homosexual theme or character. This is another case of the world accepting what Heavenly Father has forbidden. Thousands of years ago, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by the Lord because of this sin, and the Lord's policies haven't changed. Chad's going to complain about the existence of gay people in a number of other books, too. He brought it up multiple times when complaining about how society is falling apart. I think national recognition of gay marriage in 2015 really freaked him out. Also, he seems especially bothered by the possibility that the church might change its stance on homosexuality, the way it did with black men and women receiving temple ordinances. Something else that I would wager bothers Chad. The next section begins, "It is rare for people to break the law of chastity without first engaging in kissing." I guess Chad hasn't seen Pretty Woman. I struggled to think of a euphemism for the next topic that isn't vulgar, and I decided to let George Costanza explain it for me.
My mother caught me.
Caught you doing what?
You know. I was alone.
If you ever want to study how to talk about something without saying it directly, Seinfeld is a masterclass in skirting subjects. On this particular subject, Chad writes, "This is a sin that Satan would love to have you rationalize, because it can open the door to much greater sins. Webster's dictionary defines it as touching oneself for sexual gratification. This is another sin that the world and entertainment industry have tried to say is acceptable, but it is not acceptable to the Lord." I wonder why Chad isn't sharing any personal stories in this section. Actually, what I meant to say was, I'm relieved Chad isn't sharing any personal stories in this section. Note Chad's belief that this is somehow Hollywood's fault. Pretty sure such activities existed long before Hollywood. Finally, we reach a section with a name that won't anger YouTube, necking and petting. And wouldn't you know it, Chad starts off the section with a personal story. "Growing up, I heard many church leaders condemn necking and petting. But there was one problem. They never really defined it. As a deacon, I had no idea what they were talking about, and many of my friends felt the same way. When it came to necking, we imagined some strange ritual where a boy and girl somehow wrapped their necks around each other. I had seen some relay games at our ward youth activity where we would hold an egg under our chins and then attempt to pass it to someone else without using our hands. It surprised me that such a game would be played at a church activity, because that game came awfully close to what I thought necking was, and I still couldn't see how that would bring much pleasure. Petting was another activity I was very cautious about. I made sure I never patted the head or hair of any girl. Maybe you have felt the same confusion." No, Chad, I haven't. This is why we need sexual education in schools, so that incredibly naive young people like Chad don't become erotically fixated on giraffes. Random aside, Chad quotes President Kimball a lot in this chapter, and President Kimball always refers to French kissing as the soul kiss. I've never heard this expression before, and I'm curious if it's an LDS thing or a Rocky Mountains thing or just a President Kimball thing. I Googled, but all that came up was an Olivia Newton-John song. President Kimball explains that Satan tricks teenagers into petting, which he seems to think can only happen in cars. Chad comments, "If you are involved in such activities, decide to stop immediately. It might be one of the most painful decisions you make, but you will be grateful you did. If your partner urges you to continue such acts, you have received your answer concerning whether your relationship is based on love or lust. As you put the sin of petting in your past, discuss with your bishop the process of repentance. He can help you begin the path to full forgiveness. I'm sure that Chad dislikes teenagers almost as much as he dislikes children, but he can't be so disconnected from youth culture that he really thinks teenagers are going to go to their bishops and confess that they love petting and need help stopping. The last section in this chapter is corn, the literature of the devil, as President Hinckley said. After defining corn, Chad writes, "Such material was once tucked away and not readily available to the general public. Laws were designed to keep it from being sold openly. But with the invention of the internet, corn has spread across the world. At the same time, magazines that would never have been allowed on store newsstands are now openly displayed. Sadly, it seems no law or government can halt it. So now it is up to each individual to avoid it at all costs." I'm not sure if he's complaining specifically about corny magazines, which certainly aren't being openly displayed, or if he's now additionally complaining about risque magazine covers in general. Thus ends chapter 27. Chapter 29, Swearing. A sad reflection on our society is the casual use of the Lord's name in vain, and other swear words, in television shows and music, usually in an effort to make people laugh. It is not a laughing matter to the Lord, though. The word God is used properly in prayers and in the scriptures, but much more often the phrase is heard as an angry, sarcastic, or surprised exclamation. It seems the vocabulary of some people is so limited that they can't hardly say anything else. The same goes with the common four-letter words that are heard all throughout society. This takes me right back to my old Kentucky home. Some people can't hardly say nothing other than beep, beep, beep. I'm really curious if Chad swears in private. I suspect he's as hypocritical about that as he is about everything else. That theory is bolstered by this story he tells. As a teenager, I worked as a member of a parks maintenance crew, and each morning we would meet at our main office, then pile into a truck to travel to whatever project we were working on that day. The person who would drive us to each project was a middle-aged man who was the nicest guy in the world, but he couldn't resist telling us teenage boys some off-color jokes. It was uncomfortable for me, but I stayed silent. Day after day that summer, this man would tell us these dirty jokes. As the summer went on, the jokes kept getting worse. Finally, a fellow employee told the man, "Knock it off! We've heard enough." It worked. The man stopped telling the jokes. I only wish I had showed that same type of courage earlier in the summer, because 20 years later, some of those crude, dirty jokes still roll into my mind once in a while. Again, we see Chad failing to speak up or take action. He was very much a follower when he was young. I wonder when that changed. Thus ends chapter 29. Chapter 31, Temptation. In many ways, the Star Wars movies parallel real life. There are opposing powers constantly at work. Star Wars creator George Lucas refers to them as the Force and the dark side. We know them simply as good and evil. I don't want to geek out over a fandom that I'm not even part of, but the Force and the dark side aren't opposites. The Force is a type of energy, and it can be used for either good or evil. This is a very simple concept, but I'm not at all shocked that Chad couldn't get it right. Although you might think that a chapter on temptation would revisit topics like soul kisses, Prince Albert piercings, and the wide availability of Maxim magazine, but it goes in a completely different direction. False doctrine. Sometimes rumors are spread by church members, or teachings are given, that just don't feel right. but they seem to make sense. How can we determine if such things are true? Thankfully, there are ways we can recognize false doctrine. They include: 1. What do the standard works have to say about it? 2. What do the latter-day presidents of the church say on the subject, particularly the living prophet? 3. The Holy Ghost, the test of the Spirit. By the Spirit we may know the truth of all things. Why is false doctrine discussed under temptation? Unless Chad is tempted by false doctrine. When any teaching or doctrine is in conflict with or contrary to one or all of these requirements, it must be set aside as false. When the Lord has something to reveal to the members of the church, it will be through his prophet. Every few years, rumors seem to spread about messengers appearing and telling people about the future. You don't say. Then he relates a story from President Lee about a man who listened to a false prophet who started saying that everyone needed to store 3 years' worth of food instead of attending a conference and listening to what the actual prophet had to say. Look, we're all hypocrites from time to time. It's impossible not to be, because every situation is so complex, and sometimes something that seemed like a perfectly reasonable blanket statement at the time it was uttered turns out to not be applicable to every situation after all. But Chad's transformation from devout rule follower to false prophet is so incredible that it makes me wonder what on earth happened in Chad's life that allowed it. I mean, Chad wrote out a 3-step process for determining the validity of any doctrine. Why didn't he use it? Take Chad's belief in multiple probations, known outside of Mormondom as reincarnation. What do the standard works have to say about multiple probations? I don't think they're in there. I could be wrong about that. I haven't read all of them. But I don't think that even comes up. What do the latter-day presidents of the church have to say about reincarnation? Well, they say it's fake. What does the Spirit have to say about it? I would say I don't know what the Spirit told Chad, except that he actually wrote in his autobiography about asking the Spirit about reincarnation. This is from page 36. I checked out a book from the library that talked about reincarnation and past lives, and I can remember the dark feelings the book generated in me. I knew the Spirit was telling me, this is false. If you look at these 3 questions, you can see where Chad went wrong. He started off ignoring the authority of the standard works, which include the Bible, the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price. He started ignoring the authority of church leaders. The only question he seemed to still give any weight to was the test of the Spirit, which is easily the test with the most room for error. Humans are fallible. Sometimes, even if we're listening really hard, we don't hear the right message. And I think Chad learned at an early age that if he said the Spirit had told him something was true, no one was going to accuse him of lying. Thus ends chapter 31. And we're going to skip the last 6 chapters, so for all practical purposes, thus ends the youth of Zion. And really, thus ends the canon of Chad Daybell's published works. We have gotten through all of them. Kind of blown away. How could we have made this book better? The biggest issue is that it isn't really a book of spiritual guidance. It's a book about sinning. The majority of the text is taken up with admonitions on avoiding sin and being obedient. Even the chapter on happiness is about the evils of pleasure seeking. The chapter on integrity isn't about how to develop integrity. It's about how people who drink coffee don't have integrity. There's a 10-page chapter on Sunday activities that includes a half-page list of things it's okay to do on Sunday. And the other 9 pages are just rants about things you shouldn't do on Sunday. There are a few chapters that don't have a negative focus, but mostly this book is just a collection of quotes from LDS leaders telling teens not to sin. And it's pretty disingenuous of Chad to have tried to frame it any other way. And while Chad writes the book as if he's speaking to young people, his admission that the book is really a collection of source material that parents can use to win arguments with their children feels a lot more honest. What Chad doesn't realize is that teenagers are going to see through this. Nobody has a better BS detector than a 16-year-old, and nobody would take more delight in ripping this kind of book apart than a 16-year-old. They're going to immediately identify this as having been written by someone who's made zero effort to actually understand teenagers and is only interested in manipulating them. And I'm not saying that teens don't need advice and should just be allowed to do anything. I'm saying that if you want them to actually listen, then you as the author have to demonstrate respect and understanding. Frankly, the entire concept of this book feels misguided. Because the prophet said so isn't much more compelling than because I said so. This isn't really a book I can fix because it's so fundamentally flawed. Let's discuss what we've learned about Chad from reading these books. We've learned that he's a man who won't apologize even when he knows he's in the wrong. We've learned he's capable of holding grudges for decades. Even though these two books were published fairly early in Chad's journey from perfect Mormon to evil cult leader, there are definitely cracks showing. I keep thinking of that scene early in Ghostbusters when the dean fires the guy from the university, and he says,
Dr. Venkman, we believe that the purpose of science is to serve mankind. You, however, seem to regard science as some kind of dodge or hustle.
You seem to regard science as some kind of dodge or hustle. I feel like Chad has the same attitude about religion. Even before he was a full-blown cult leader killing people for their life insurance, he was trying to make money off people's faith in a very insincere way. I mean, even if you're a conservative member of the LDS Church, I think you'd probably agree that these are low-effort, poorly written books intended to make a quick buck, and that they aren't going to appeal to young people in any way. Teens deserve thoughtful, rational, sensitive life advice from people who genuinely like them and respect them and want to see them flourish in their spiritual lives, not manipulative money grabs that only counsel obedience. All of which leads to a question. Given that Chad was so obsessed with religion and wanted so desperately to be seen as a spiritual teacher with wisdom to spare, why didn't he write nonfiction books of religious advice for adults? He wrote 2 religious books for teens, 1 for children, and he put his name on 5 more for kids that I believe Tammy wrote. But his autobiography and his cemetery sexton memoir are the only pieces of adult nonfiction he ever published, and neither one could be considered religious advice. One of the primary complaints you'll find in reviews of Living on the Edge of Heaven is that his near-death experiences are just flashes in the pan. They take up all of 5 pages. I think that on some level, Chad knew that an adult audience was going to see through him if he took the risk of writing religious nonfiction for them. He got away with it in his fiction because he never actually had to expound on any religious concepts other than obedience. But if he'd tried to write nonfiction, it would have become painfully apparent that his spiritual beliefs weren't in line with the LDS churches. That's part of why so little of the actual text in these 2 books is his. 95% of the youth of Zion is quotes from church leaders. Probably 2/3 of the Aaronic priesthood is quotes from church leaders. It's easy to hide heretical beliefs behind quotes from the prophets. At least in books for young people that they'll likely get bored and stop reading 10 pages in anyway. By 2004, Chad was already getting in trouble for the spiritual elements he was putting in his adult fiction. He ruined the profitability of Chasing Paradise when he got it booted from Deseret Books. He would have been opening himself up to a lot of scrutiny from the church as soon as he started writing religious nonfiction for adults. Adults would have wondered why false doctrine is one of only 2 subsections in the chapter on temptation. And that brings us to the end of my series on the published work of Chad Daybell. I can't believe I made it through 20 books, and I definitely can't believe how many of you came on this journey with me. I'm so grateful. Would I have done this without an audience? Probably. But knowing that people were watching made it so much more fun. And I've loved your snarky comments and your insights and your compassion for Chad and Lori's victims. So I made you a little thank you gift. It's a video that will drop in a few days, and I think you'll get a kick out of it. I certainly had fun making it. If you're wondering why I never covered Chad's unpublished masterpiece, Loinfire, although technically it was published to a jury, I'm saving it for Lori's trial, if that ever happens. And I'm hoping to talk about Visions of Glory in December, so please keep your eyes out for that. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. Please don't reach out to anyone involved in this case, and remember to use your words wisely. And thank you for everything. What does it mean to act in Jesus' name? My neighbor is apparently blowing leaves. Chad begins this chapter by explaining that if you ever date, you won't be able to get married. No, wait, that's not... That's not right. What is in my eye? This doesn't have anything to do with nobility. This is about obedience again. Chapter 4, dancing. No, dating. Just did dancing. Can you hear the church bells ringing? So it shouldn't be a surprise that he tells a slightly different version of this story in his autobiography. Instead, he resorts to sports metaphors and I was fairly... Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by the Lord because of this sin. Because Chad has broken into the surprisingly specific sections in television shows and music. The young men in my ward would travel from our small town to Tabernacle Square. Oh, that's not what that says. We also visited a man named, buried somewhere beneath his virulent humor. The two young ladies who suffered through it shall remain nameless. Rename? And of course, the binding of this book has completely fallen apart. So he associates it with room conditions in 10. He told us he knew how to get front row seats to the Salt Lake set, blah, blah. So it's like a muscle and you have to... What's the word I want? Crap. Our family used to go to Capitol Reef every Memorial Day, going on to become a Melchizedek priest. Blah. Every new television season. I have no idea if this is true. This is why I shouldn't cut my bangs right before I film. I am able to write, but anything beyond basic. Even if Fluffy is nipping at your feet, is that an airplane? This is just a flat out lie. I certainly wouldn't. Excuse me. Exercise is the word I want. The bottom of the river was Sue, who's a famous LDS. Here's the lesson Chad shares with us. Part of the book... Is that another plane? Yeah, it is. I don't usually film during the day. I usually film at night. And I'm remembering why. Thus ends... What's the name of this book?